Nowell, Debussy Variations on a Mendelssohn Theme by Randolph Bartlett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was Christmas Eve, a fact which David Pearson realized less from any feelings of his own in the matter than from observing that the Union League Club was just a little duller, if possible, than usual. His cronies were scattered among dozens of festive affairs, invitations to which he had persistently declined, preferring the boredom of a few days in comparative loneliness to the boredom of noise and gaiety in which he took no interest. He was distinctly and uncompromisingly an old bachelor, and if he had had any sense of the fitness of things, he would have been sitting in a dimly lighted room beside an open fire, watching wreaths of tobacco smoke form tender pictures of days gone by. But he disregarded all the best traditions, and his apartment was a blaze of light while he studied the financial pages of the Post. His attention was distracted by the sound of boys' voices singing in the street, and, idly curious, he raised his window slightly to listen.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay.
The singing was particularly bad, but it interested Pearson because he used to sing that carol himself years ago, and he experienced a little thrill to think that there were some of the pleasures of his childhood days that people had not been able to improve upon. "When did I last sing that?" he mused. "It must have been the Christmas just before I went to college." He smiled broadly at the recollection that his principal ambition then was to force his voice down low enough to sing bass, and he began to hum a counterpoint to the treble that floated up from the street. "Little Julia Connor used to sing the soprano quite prettily," he remembered. "Poor Julia! The last time I saw her, her voice had grown shrill and hard from constantly telling 4 children not to do things. But she was a lovely slip of a girl in those days. That was when all a girl needed was to be pretty and modest, and everything was brought to her. But what a noisy crowd it was at that party. After the singing was over, Julia slipped away into a quiet corner by herself. We were too boisterous for her. I remember feeling sorry for her, she seemed so neglected. So I went over and sat beside her, and we talked about the high school days that were just ended. The others romped away into another part of the big house and forgot all about us. Then I began to notice how pretty she was, and what white, tapering hands she had. She didn't object when I took one of her hands in mine and squeezed it a little. And she didn't object either when I put my arm around her shoulder, but just pretended not to notice. And then I kissed her. She couldn't help noticing that.
"Oh, David, you mustn't. It isn't right,"
she said. But she said it very softly, and there was no indignation in her voice, so I kissed her again, and a little bit harder. Then she drew away and hung her head a little. She was a very pretty girl. "Julia, I love you," I declared manfully, for I wanted more kisses, and so I think did she. I drew her closer again and repeated it, and was rewarded.
"And I love you too, David," she said.
Too soon the others came looking for us, but before the evening was over we found a few minutes more together.
"We won't tell anybody just yet," she said,
and I agreed promptly. And within a week she quarrelled with me because I danced 3 times in one evening with another girl who was a much better dancer.
"You have broken my heart," she said sadly. "I will never trust another man as long as I live."
And now pretty little Julia has 4 children and a hard, shrill voice.
While shepherds wash their flocks by night, all seated on the ground.
The boys in the street started another song, and David Pearson recalled another Christmas. It was just a few months before his graduation, and he was home for the holidays. A big church fair had been arranged for Christmas Eve, and the moving spirit was Esther Wallace. "I wonder how the rector ever would have managed without Esther," Pearson cogitated. "In fact, people used to say that if Esther Wallace didn't pay a little more attention to her own affairs and a little less to those of the church, the first thing she knew she would be an old maid. She must have been 30 then. And the way she pounced upon me and made me help her with the decorations, because, as she said, it would keep me out of mischief for a few days. It was a good deal of fun at that, and there was nothing churchy about Esther, so I didn't mind. We became very well acquainted, and when the evening of the fair arrived, and it was a big success, she kept telling me it would never have been half so good without my help."
"You've been a dear boy to give up your holiday like this," she said.
I felt that for once I was appreciated, and kept following her around all evening, ready to do anything she wanted. Of course she had to stay until the last to attend to everything, and of course I had to stay to see if there was anything I could do. And then I went into the little side room with her to help her with her coat. Those were the days of the huge sleeves, and as I tucked hers into her coat I put my arms around her and gave her a vigorous hug.
"My, but you're strong," she said. "Do you go in for athletics at college?"
It was a rather dampening matter of course way to take it, but I ignored the remark and kissed her resolutely.
"Oh, David, you mustn't. It isn't right," she said.
"Why not?" I demanded.
"Well, for one thing, I'm years and years older than you."
I swore it made no difference, and kissed her several times more.
"You're so strong,"
she murmured, and made a showing of resistance. But it was the footsteps of the janitor as he went around turning out the lights that ended the matter for just then. I walked home with her, putting my arm around her waist whenever we came to a dark stretch of street. In the porch of her house I started it again, and again my strength was too much for her. "I love you, Esther," I said at last, as it seemed the only thing to do.
"And I love you too, David," she responded. "But you must think of your career, and what your father would say. I'm much too old for you."
I didn't want to think what father would say, and declared it made no difference, that I was a man and had a right to my own life. She sighed and said I would forget all about her when I went back to college, and I denied it, with a few dozen more kisses for emphasis. Heavens, what a relief it was to me a few months later to get a note from her saying it was all a mistake and that she was going to marry the rector. And so I wrote, "You have broken my heart. I will never trust another woman as long as I live."
It came upon the midnight clear, that glorious song of old.
That's funny. I suppose that song really has more to do with my being here tonight than any other one thing. What a row father and I were having that Christmas. I wanted to get out of his business and have him furnish me with capital for a venture of my own, and he refused. So I said I would quit anyhow, go to South Africa and make my own way. We had quite a crowd at the house for the holidays, and it naturally percolated everywhere that things were in a general mess in the family. Then, after dinner Christmas Eve, they all began singing carols in the music room. One by one they all dropped out and left the singing to Clara Forrester. Mother had been sounding the praises of Clara until I was tired of her very name, and so I sulked off into the den. A little later Clara came in, humming, and pretended to be looking for something. She fiddled around a while, and then, standing behind my chair, deliberately parodied the lines, "And man at war with man hears not the love song that they bring." Only she sang it, the love song that I bring. It was neatly done, but I knew those old hymns pretty well and recognized the change. But the point was that I was worn out with the row and welcomed anything that might prove a congenial diversion. "You have a beautiful voice," I said, by way of starting conversation.
"Thank you kindly, sir," she said.
She warbled and sat down on the arm of my big chair.
"You don't seem very Christmassy," she remarked,
and proceeded to impart a little cheerfulness to the atmosphere of the den. Mother caught sight of us and kept the remainder of the crowd steered in other directions. It was not long until I began to feel that life was not such a gloomy vale of tears after all. And so it came about, quite logically, that I pulled her down upon my lap and kissed her.
"Oh, David, you mustn't. It isn't right,"
she protested, but not violently. "Why not?"
"Well, you see, we're not. That is, you're not."
"Oh, yes, I am," I declared, for she was a very nice girl, and it seemed the thing to do to reassure her, especially as the terms were pleasingly vague.
"You are what?"
"What you meant." So we fenced back and forth, but she cornered me, so if it had to be, I might as well make a good job of it, I decided. I drew her very close, kissed her thoroughly, and said, "I love you, Clara."
"And I love you too, David,"
she whispered, and snuggled in my arms.
"You won't go to South Africa, will you?"
she pleaded a little later.
"I wouldn't like it in South Africa."
And of course I promised, and went straight to my father and agreed to his plans without reservation. Then, because Clara's family moved to Chicago, and I insisted upon not marrying until I had made a place for myself in the world independently of my sinecure father's business, and would not go to Chicago, she broke off the engagement with a note which read,
"You have broken my heart. I will never trust another man as long as I live."
It was fully 6 months before she married into the Beef Trust.
"O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie."
There seems to be no limit to the number of ways a man can make an idiot of himself, but Christmas time apparently collects them in one group and defies you to escape them all. My luck has not failed me yet, though, and I suppose I'm immune now. But I tremble to think of the things that might have happened. There was Maybelle Graham, for example. That was a narrow escape. It was the mistletoe did it. Probably I am no more averse to contributing my share to the fun on these occasions than most men, but I think I would have hesitated a long time before making any advances toward the giddy Maybelle in any other circumstances. I never saw a girl so plain and yet so brazen about it. A girl with an appearance like hers should be becomingly modest. Then people will be sorry for her, and eventually someone will marry her out of pity. So Christmas was a field day for her. She used to get herself invited to the most exclusive places, and I could never see why, for everyone always treated her as if she had come in by the tradesman's entrance when no one was watching the door. It must have been at the Thatchers' it happened. They were cousins of hers, and the way that girl was ignored! The others would be captured from time to time as they quite inadvertently found themselves, or were found, beneath the sprig of little white devilberries, But Maybelle could stand there by the hour, and she was as safe as if she had been in an empty house. You couldn't help feeling sorry for her. At least I couldn't. So I made a special effort to be nice to her, and then, waiting until no one was looking, on the principle that charity should not be made a public matter, I caught her waiting patiently under the bough and did the only fair thing. Did she appreciate it? Did she take it at its face value and let it go at that? She did not. She hung on with both arms, and the next thing we knew we were discovered, and her ardour was misinterpreted. You would naturally not expect a girl to be in that position unless she had received encouragement. So I had to protect myself, and for the remainder of the 2 days that the party lasted I had to make good. I endured it as well as I could, not being especially interested in any of the other attractions anyhow, and comforted myself with the thought that in a day or two I would be back in town and could escape. Escape Maybelle! What a chance! She telephoned twice a day. She wrote notes to me complaining of my neglect and saying that all her folks were talking about it. She invited me to dinners and things until I exhausted all my excuses and had to run in duplicates. Finally, she wrote and asked in so many words if she had been misled by my actions at the Christmas party. I replied that she apparently had. And then she wrote, "You have broken my heart. I will never trust another man as long as I live." And I guess she never did, for the last I heard she was still a spinster.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
David Pearson drew a deep breath of relief. He always did when he thought of that escape. But on this occasion it reminded him of another adventure that had an element of peril of another sort, and likewise had its inception under the mistletoe. I wonder when someone will tabulate the various kinds of kisses, and list opposite each the occasions when it shall be permitted. When a man kisses a woman under the mistletoe, he doesn't mean anything by it, and the woman has no business to take advantage of the situation to ensnare him. I could never understand why Alice Harrison did it. There were plenty of men anxious to make love to her and tell her how badly her husband was treating her. Possibly it was because I was not in the crowd, and she wanted to complete the collection. I don't know that I am any more squeamish than most men, but somehow I never have overcome the old-fashioned idea that a married woman is the property of another man, and theft is not in my line. Still, when I kissed Alice that Christmas Eve, the way she took it and responded undermined whatever stability in the matter that I possessed. Lord, the cleverness of that woman! Having started the train of thought or emotion or whatever it is, she turned away with a little laugh and pretended that it was an isolated incident to be immediately forgotten. She played me like an experienced angler until I was mad about her and almost forcibly dragged her into a dark corner of the conservatory. And there I returned her gift of the early evening with all the accumulated interest.
"Oh, David, you mustn't. It isn't right,"
the hypocrite gasped. "Why not?" I demanded. Hoarsely is, I believe, the proper description of my tone of voice.
"I'm a married woman,"
she explained. Of course, my proper answer was that she should have thought of that sooner. But instead I made the usual remarks about her brute of a husband. I presume that to the lover of a married woman her husband is always a brute. As a matter of fact, my recollection of Harrison is that he was a very decent fellow, and probably never did anything that Alice had not provoked him into. After indicating that such a husband did not deserve such a woman as she, I made my declaration. "I love you, Alice."
"And I love you too, David," she whispered, and then, "But we must hurry back, or we shall be missed." We were able to see each other only occasionally, and for mere fleeting moments, until one day she telephoned saying that she would be alone that evening, and I might call. But there happened to be a rather nasty murder trial going on at the time, and after reading some of the evidence I decided not to. She was very angry at first, and then very tearful. "I don't believe you love me at all," she said plaintively. The time seemed ripe, so I said perhaps there had been a mistake, and the woman had the effrontery to say, "You've broken my heart. I will never trust another man as long as I live."
Nowell, 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 sing we clear.
Oh, those were the days when Christmas meant a pandemonium, a lot of fussing about presents, and a great deal of indigestibly rich food, David Pearson's recollections continued. And when I think how I used to miss them after I really began to have serious interest in life, I'm surprised at myself. Loneliness is the self-pity of a man with no resources of his own. So it was quite natural, before I had developed my attitude of independence toward existence, that I should feel lonely, and especially around Christmas time. It was the psychological moment for the arrival of Helena Birch. I wonder if that woman ever was married. She was rather vague in her allusions to her experience in that direction. But it didn't and doesn't matter. She was not encumbered at that time, at least. It was just after my first generally known success in the market. Where was it I met her? Must have been at one of those informal and somewhat questionable parties of Blake's. There was a good deal of that sort of thing going on at that time. I suppose there is yet. She was quite a frequent member of the gatherings at various bachelor apartments. One evening she asked me what I was going to do Christmas, and I told her I supposed I should be deserted as usual. "So shall I," she said. "Let's have a little dinner and a mutual sympathy evening at my apartment." It sounded interesting, and I accepted. I never did know just what to make of Helena at first. She had a bohemian way with her, and yet everything was entirely proper. There was an invisible and yet clearly defined line beyond which you would not think of trespassing. At least I wouldn't. I always was a duffer at that kind of business. The evening was a great success. The dinner was perfectly thought out and the appointments exquisite. She was a connoisseur in wines, and had mastered the art of removing all the grossness from the act of eating. Then, while I smoked, she played for me, and sang in a careless sort of way that a man likes to be sung to, as much as to say, "I know I have no voice, but you are a friend, and it doesn't matter so much, because you know I'm trying to entertain you as well as I can." So eventually I became quite mellowed, and when she was tired singing and came over and sat beside me on the davenport, I naturally drew her over to me and kissed her. "I love you, Helena," I said. "And I love you too, David," she answered. But even at the time it came to me with a sort of chilling effect that there was no conviction in her voice. Perhaps it was an echo of my own absence of ardour, but to me, recalling other Christmases, her tone sounded hard and cold, and there was little warmth in her embrace. However, it passed, for what it was worth. I saw her several times after that, and usually at her apartment. Then one evening she said, "David, I think I would like to have a nicer place than this, but I can't quite afford it. I've been looking at an apartment over on Riverside Drive. It is just what I want, and I could entertain you so much better there." "I couldn't ask for any better entertainment," I protested. But she enlarged on the advantages of the more expensive place, and it would only cost 10,000 a year, and 10,000, she averred, was nothing to me, but her income was so limited, and so on. And then I was very thankful that I had been a model of discretion. I said I would think it over, but I never went back. She telephoned several times and tried to make engagements for dinner, but I always managed to evade. Finally, one day she said in a tearful voice,
"David, aren't you coming to see me any more?"
"I think I had better not," I told her, and then I wondered if she would say it. She did.
"You have broken my heart. I will never trust another man as long as I live."
But I had heard it done so much better that it made no impression.
When Christ was born of Mary free, in excelsis Gloria.
How different was that Christmas dinner with Margaret Swain. I wonder why I didn't marry her. Perhaps it was because I had no encouragement, and had grown too old to care to engage in a long, stern chase. John Walton accomplished it, but it took him more than a year of hard work. She had been a widow about 5 years when she took pity on me and invited me to what she called a solitary feast of the forsaken at her house. I think that was the most homelike place I ever visited. There was no tinsel and show about it, just a plain home of a wholesome woman. We talked about old friends and old times, even about her dead husband, without the least sign of sentiment. I began to feel that I was leading an extremely lonely life and losing touch with everything except business. Later, in her little drawing-room, we ran out of topics of conversation, and she employed the phonograph for diversion. We listened in silence to 6 records. "Margaret," I said finally, "what would you say if I were to make Christmas love to you?" She laughed happily.
"Do so by all means if you think you ought to," she said. "But always remember that Christmas love, like Christmas presents, is not durable."
"Your levity," I said, "has broken my heart. I will never trust a woman again as long as I live."
"David," she said solemnly, "have you ever trusted one?"
And I was forced to admit that I had not.
God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay.
Hang it, they're beginning all over again.
David Pearson leaned out of the window and bargained with the waifs to end the concert in consideration of a piece of gold which was forthwith paid. Whereupon the old bachelor returned comfortably to his study of the financial pages of the Post. But beside a fireplace in a distant home, a middle-aged woman who had once been slim and fair was singing snatches of song as she and her husband decorated a fir tree and wrote the names of 4 children on many parcels. And she did not think of David Pearson all evening. And in a quiet rectory, another woman was making a list of poor families that must not be forgotten in the morning, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. And in another home the wife of a millionaire was sewing busily on a silken trifle that was to be her own gift to her husband, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. And in a mission in the slums, an unusually unprepossessing woman was being wept upon by a group of grateful mothers, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. And in a far distant city, a woman was telling her husband how happy she was that they had left an old life behind them, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. And in a handsome apartment, a mature but still beautiful woman was entertaining one of the merriest of gatherings, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. and in one of the most homelike homes of all, a pleasant-faced woman was enjoying the spectacle of a large house-party of young folk engaged in the pastimes of Yule, and she did not think of David Pearson all evening. Yet he had remembered all of them. End of Nowell, Debussy Variations on a Mendelssohn Theme by Randolph Bartlett. Recorded by Ruth Golding. Christmas 2015.